All right, let's get rolling. So welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Katie Anderson. I am one of the owners here at Appearing Management Group. If we haven't had an opportunity to meet, welcome. We are going to be talking about effective meetings today. And our goal for today is to really take you through what are the basics of the meetings that you as a board member might be presiding over. What is the statutory and government, governing documents requirements? How do we go about organizing those meetings so that they are effective for both you as a board member and for us as a management company? What are some tools that you can utilize in these meetings? Ideally, we always love to say that the goal would be a 1 hour board meeting. I know that sounds funny. For those of you who run board meetings, you might have longer ones and say, no way, can we do a 1 hour board meeting? There's a way. So we'll share with you some of those tips. And then we're going to close out the session by talking a little bit about how to handle difficult homeowners, whether it be in a board meeting or communication in general. We're going to touch on that today because that seems to be an ever-growing dynamic for our communities. So first, let's dive into a little bit of the basics of board meetings or meetings in general. Your governing documents as a foundation are going to set the requirements for your meetings. They are going to say, how often you need to be meeting, what's the notice process for those meetings, etc. And so we always start with that foundation of what do your governing documents say? And then a little bit is, based upon the needs and wants of the board and the community. Some of our smaller communities, may only meet once or twice a year. Some of you might be meeting quarterly. Some of your larger communities may be meeting more frequently. We really have gotten away from that perspective of most of our communities aren't requiring monthly meetings. And part of that is just by setting up some effective operational things that help decisions happen in between those meetings. But your governing documents are going to set those parameters for how often you're meeting. And those guidelines in your governing documents are also going to dictate under what circumstances can you have a meeting. So quorum is something hopefully most of you are aware of, but quorum means the number of individuals present in order to hold a meeting. There are different quorum standards for different meetings, and those quorum standards can generally be found in your bylaws. And, you also are going to have that notice requirement that's going to be laid out in your governing documents. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that as well. So what are the types of meetings that communities have? So in most instances, you're going to have two classifications of meetings. You're going to have a board meeting and you're going to have an owners meetings. Your board meeting is going to be presided on or presided over by your board of directors. And your board meetings are meant to be operational in nature. They're meant for the board to be making decisions, setting policy, doing those types of things that are necessary to keep the organization moving forward. Your owners meetings are different in that they're actually presided on by the board of director, or they're presided on by the owners. So think about it from this perspective. You would make, the board would make motions in the board meeting, whereas owners can make motions in owners meetings. And there's generally, there are two distinct types of owners meetings that documents reference: an annual meeting and a special meeting. And your annual meeting is something you hold every year for the purpose of electing your board of directors. And it's that sort of corporate piece that needs to happen every single year. And then a special meeting can be certain reserved rights that are in your governing documents, such as amending your governing documents, whether it's your CC&Rs or your bylaws. If there's a special vote that needs to happen for financial reasons, if you're passing a special assessment or you're increasing assessments over a certain threshold, there could be other decisions that are the right of your owners to make and not the right of the board to make. And therefore, you would need to have an owners meeting in order for your community to make that decision. And so your governing documents are going to lay out what type of meetings that the community needs to have. They're going to tell you what's the process for calling those meetings. And then they're going to dictate what is the notice requirement for those meetings. So you probably hear us say this a lot, or, other providers in the community, like, it depends. What is the notice requirement for your community? It depends. It depends on what your governing documents say. So in most instances, the general notice requirement for a board meeting is 3 days. Some documents are going to dictate differently. Some documents are silent, so you're going to rely on the state statutes. So for a board meeting, it's pretty standard that they're 3 days, but you might have something different in your documents if they're older documents or just the developer wrote something different in them. Now, for owners meetings, the notice requirement is a little different, and how we go about noticing those communities kind of dictates the procedure for those meetings. So for example, in an annual meeting, your governing documents are generally going to say that you need to provide notice for an annual meeting no later than 10 days, but no sooner than 50. So between 50 days and 10 days, we're sending notification to your community to say that we're having an annual meeting for the purpose of electing a board. Here's what the agenda is. Here's a proxy you need to complete, and please return this information to us. Now, there's kind of a sweet spot. We generally try and make sure that those notices go out right around 30 days. That gives us enough time to get proxies returned. And for those meetings, you are going to have a different set of quorum. So for a board meeting, if you have a 5-member board, you need 3 members there in order to hold the meeting. For an owners meeting, you are going to have the quorum that's dictated in your governing documents. And so in that governing document, it might say in order for you to have your annual meeting, you're required to have 20% of your community in person or by proxy. And that means that we have to get 20% of your ownership to return proxies or make sure they show up in order to be able to hold the meeting and conduct business. And so that's why, sometimes our staff is calling owners prior to meetings, making sure that we get those proxies in hand. So the notice requirement is really going to be dictated based off of your governing documents, based off of what that process looks like. A special meeting is generally going to fall under the same sort of notice requirement as an annual meeting. It's in most instances no less than 10, no more than 50. And there may be additional documents that have to be sent for a special meeting. So for example, if you're going to be voting on an amendment to the governing documents, you have to notice the community of what that amendment is that you'll be voting on. So procedurally, most of this is laid out in your governing documents, and our managers are going to help guide you through this. But it's important for you as a board member to understand where these requirements come from. And so from that basis of how those meetings run, the owners meeting and the board meetings, they run pretty similar as far as, we're still running them with Robert's Rules of Order, and we'll get into that in just a second. But in those instances, how we structure those meetings is a little bit different. Your owners meetings are going to engage the community much more than you would normally in a standard board meeting. So who attends the meetings? It's something to understand, and if you've attended any of our board trainings before, you've heard us talk about the open meetings law. We talk about it a lot in our board basic training, mostly around the provision of making sure that boards aren't violating that open meetings law. Oregon statute requires that decisions of the board be made in an open meeting so that your ownership has the right to observe the debate for that decision. And so there's this, sometimes difficult balance of discussing sensitive issues in a board meeting, and boards sometimes want to have these conversations outside of those meetings. It's important to understand that that open meetings law applies. We have to call the board meeting. We have to notice the board meeting. We have to allow owners to attend. There's this kind of general joke in our industry that if there's a large turnout, you be a little nervous, because usually people show up at the meetings when they've got something to be frustrated about, or they want to share with the board, or they want to complain about. If you want to get people to engage, we have a general joke about, do something like cut down the trees or raise assessments, and people will show up and have an opinion. But for the most part, the crowds that are going to come, or those that are going to engage in a board meeting versus an owners meeting, is going to be different. We really do want owners to attend both of those types of meetings, but the owners meeting is really ran more from their perspective, and the board meeting is really there for the board to conduct business and not so much for your owners to interject into. And so the format of those meetings are both very different. So, bylaws and the state statutes, as I mentioned, are going to lay out sort of the protocol for how these meetings take place. In general, for each of our board meetings, you're going to have, an agenda that has an open forum section, and that allows for owners to sort of share their thoughts with the board, and then the board can move on to their business at hand. The board meetings are not generally ran from this perspective of owners having opinions on everything that comes up on the board agenda. If meetings are being ran like that, then you're going to find that those meetings are going to last a lot longer. You might have a hard time arriving at consensus. You might have ownership that's frustrated if the board makes a different decision. So putting those guardrails on your board meetings is really helpful, and it helps prevent that sort of disruption in the business of the board. And so your board meetings are ran by the board. Owners speak during the open forum section. We do have processes and procedures with the Roberts Rules of Order to help prevent some of the owners that might be trying to monopolize the meetings or sort of take over the board conversation. The interesting part about, the way that the statutes are written in Oregon and your governing documents are developed is that non-owners don't have a right to sort of attend meetings, but owners have the right to be represented by legal counsel should they choose. So if you have a contentious issue that might be coming up, like you're conducting a hearing or something along those lines, there may be a reason that an owner wants to bring their attorney. Now, our general recommendation is that if an owner shows up with their attorney and you weren't aware that they were showing up with their attorney, you might want to adjourn that meeting to a later date where the association can have their legal counsel present. It's not generally a good idea to conduct, sort of a board to owner conversation with them being represented and the association being unrepresented. So understand that they do have a right to be represented, but so does the association. And if you were unaware that they were showing up with legal counsel, you can adjourn the meeting and you can move it to a later date where both parties can be equally represented. The other piece that's important to understand about the statutes is there, are only a few things that can be discussed in executive session. Again, sometimes it's difficult to have these conversations if you're touching on a sensitive issue, but if you are not discussing advice from legal counsel, human resources issues, action against a homeowner, or collections matters, you cannot go into executive session. So, if you're discussing a potentially emotional decision about a design review application, for example, that isn't something that the board could convene into executive session. You would still have to discuss that in an open meeting. So be aware that those are statutorily dictated, and there are only a few reasons that the board can convene into executive session, and our managers can kind of help with that process. But for the most part, all of the debate, discussion, and decisions have to happen in an open board meeting. So all of our meetings are going to start from the perspective of establishing an agenda. What is the goal for the meeting? What are we hoping to accomplish? It's integral to the success. So our manager is going to do the initial draft of that agenda and send that to the board president. So the way that our process works, if you've attended some of our prior trainings, you know that our contract, and we encourage sort of one point of contact so that our managers aren't taking direction from, 3, 5, 6, 7 different people that might be on the board. And so our managers are going to send that agenda to the president to oversee. The president might send that out to the other board members for their feedback, but that line of communication goes between our managers and the president. And then the agenda, is publicized in advance of the meeting to let the owners know, here's what we're going to be talking about. And it allows for a format for the board to follow and sort of make sure that you're organizing conversation and that the meeting is making the best use of everybody's time. So what do our agendas look like? This is going to be the typical format depending upon the complexity of your community. You might have other things in there. You might have unfinished business. You might have more staff reports. You might have maintenance team that gives you staff reports in there. But in most instances, this is the general format that the meeting is going to follow. You're going to have a call to order. You're going to have a homeowner forum section, consent agenda. So the consent agenda is a very convenient and effective use for items that don't require a lot of discussion and debate. And so we will generally put things on the consent agenda that need ratification. So any decisions that you've made in between the meetings that the board's made by consent over email, we ratify those in a future meeting. And so your ratified decisions are going to be included in the consent agenda. Acceptance of financials, approval of prior minutes that the board, has already seen, commented, and revised. Those are all in the consent agenda because you can make a motion to approve all of the items with one motion on the consent agenda. So we have acceptance of financials in there. We have meeting minutes. There can be, I move to approve the items noted under the consent agenda, requires a second. That motion is then voted on and it's recorded for all of the things listed underneath there. So then the board doesn't have to go through the process of passing a motion for every one of those items. Now, if there's something that is in the consent agenda that does require debate or discussion, then procedurally what we'd recommend is that you move that out of the consent agenda either into unfinished business or into new business and allow the board then to address that item like they would a typical agenda. But the consent agenda is really meant to, get as much of that sort of typical business off of the plate in one motion without taking an overabundance of the board's time on things that might not need to be debated or discussed. Staff and committee reports. So this is going to be your manager's report. If you have a design review committee, any other committee that you might have, you're going to have, listed under this section of the agenda as an opportunity for them to submit any activity that's happened since you last met, any decisions that they may need from the board since you last met, or things that they may need the board to decide on to keep moving forward. Then you're going to have your new business section. This is going to, be, again, all policies and decisions that the board needs to be set. We're not putting things on the agenda just for the sake of debating or discussing them. If you can't arrive at a decision, then the best thing to do is to pinpoint what are those roadblocks, what are the questions, what is the information that the board needs in order to be able to move something forward. And staff can do that research, prior to a meeting and bring that information back to the board. The goal for a board meeting is to make decisions. And so items going on the agenda just for the purpose of discussing and debating them is usually a sign that your board could be deadlocked on something. So if you have the same agenda item that keeps showing up on your agenda every single month, then the board might want to ask themselves, is this something we want to take on? Is it something that's even our authority to be making a decision on? If you can't move it off your agenda, then it might not need to keep showing up on that agenda. So something to consider. Executive session, again, only if it's needed and only if you have a topic that fits the allowable topics to go into executive session. So this is going to be your basic format of an agenda. Again, every community is a little bit different, and so you're going to have slight nuances. This is just really a generalized look at what these are. So then we have, the process of the board meeting, and then the development of the minutes that come out of that meeting. And we joke about minutes, they're minutes, not hours. They are not intended to go over every bit of conversation that takes place in a board meeting. Go back to the core of what a board meeting is for. The board meeting is for making decisions, and you would approach this from the same perspective as an owner's meeting. Again, those meetings are for making decisions, and so the minutes reflect the decisions that are made. We aren't taking minutes saying, Sue said such and such, and John commented on the quality of the contractor, and they debated the color of the paint for 20 minutes, and then they finally made a decision. We are recording the motions, the seconds, the votes, the actions for staff, board, committee members, and we're putting generalized statements about what was discussed, but we are not dictating, sort of a transcript of the meeting. So that's important to understand. So a quick question about the executive session. So the executive session, again, there are 4 allowable reasons that you can go into executive session: consultation with your attorney, human resources, so employee issues. Most of you don't have employees, so that wouldn't be something that you'd be concerned about. Action against a homeowner, and collections matters. And so there's a little bit of a fine line when you're in executive session and you're discussing these things. Generally, if we're saying you're going into executive session to consult with your attorney, you generally need to have your attorney there, or the board needs to be reviewing an opinion letter or a memo from your board and able to discuss that. Now, one thing to note is that executive session has to be voted on to go into executive session. So it requires a motion of the board. Board member makes a motion. I motion to go into executive session for the purpose of consulting with our attorney. That has to be seconded and it has to be voted on. And then you go into executive session. The discussion that happens in executive session, there are no minutes taken. Again, it's executive session. And then you have to motion out of executive session, same way you motioned in, motion out, motion, second, vote. And then you have to record the decision from executive session in the open board meeting so it can be recorded in the minutes. Now, this can get a little bit tricky, but keep in mind that the motion doesn't have to be specific. So if you are consulting with your attorney is giving you advice, and the board is approving to move forward with the advice given by the attorney, the motion recorded in the board meeting can be as simple as, I move to approve the attorney moving forward with the recommendation outlined in their memo. It can be seconded on and voted. You don't have to put the contents of that memo. You don't have to reference, who you were discussing, what you were discussing, any of those things. There just has to be a notation that a decision was made and there was an authorization granted. So minutes, again, generally we're taking those meeting minutes. They are going to dictate decisions, motions, actions, things of those nature. They're not going to dictate all of the discussion. So how do you use, there's this fun little term, parliamentary procedure, and it can be a little bit intimidating, and it's much easier to use than people sometimes understand. And it's just a matter of getting comfortable with some of the terminology or understanding how to use it to your benefit. There is definitely, mechanisms of parliamentary procedure that were put in place to sort of control the crowd or control the ownership that might be getting out of hand or causing a ruckus. And we love these fun little comics for our industry. There's this great website, Go Gladly, that has all of these fun little comics that poke fun at our industry. They give us a good laugh, but this is a little bit of what we've been talking about the distinction between a board meeting known as owners meeting. Generally, you don't want a lot of owners showing up at a board meeting, causing a ruckus, being disruptive. We certainly don't want that at our owners meetings either. But there's a slightly different process for how we run those meetings and allow for some of that conversation, debate, and disagreement. So how do you use Robert's Rules of Order to your benefit to help run efficient meetings? Understand that from basic level, the president runs the board meeting. If the president is absent, then generally your vice president, or might be your chair, they might call it a chair, not a president, is going to take over that meeting. And that role of that presiding officer is to just keep the meeting moving along. And so a few tips for you, and we will send out, we have kind of a quick guide on how to make motions, and it's an easy little handout that you can keep with you for the meetings. But your basic sort of opening is you're calling the meeting to order. Your presiding officer is the one they're calling to order. I am calling this meeting to order at 12:27 on February 11th. And you're moving through that agenda then. And so it's important to understand that the presiding officer is the one that oversees the meeting. And from a strict interpretation for Robert's Rules of Order, even the members of the board have to seek to be recognized by the chair to speak and to make that motion. And so what establishes the debate of an issue in a board meeting is the motion. Now, a lot of boards will do this a little bit backwards, and that's okay. There's not a strict way of having to run these meetings. But if you have a board that tends to belabor an issue or debate and debate, not make a decision, as a chairperson, you can utilize these tactics to help move them along. If there's an issue that they're debating endlessly, but there's not a motion on the table, call for the motion and force them to either end debate or arrive at a conclusion that you are in a place to make a decision as a body. And so the motions can always be amended, but the motion helps to drive the conversation forward and move your group along so you don't spend endless amounts of time debating an issue. So you have call to order, opens the meeting. The chairperson or the president doesn't generally make the motion. They're generally calling for the motion. And you're calling for a motion by saying, can I have a motion on the consent agenda? And your fellow board members may say, so moved. And I second. And so we're recording, who made the motion, who seconded. And then your next step from that chairperson's role, that presiding officer is going to say, is there any discussion or debate about this? And that's then when that topic can be opened up for that conversation. And, it may wind up that conversation leads to, well, we might need to amend that first motion. And so someone can say, I make a motion to amend the prior motion to reflect that we're, going to do yada, yada, yada. Now, the person that made the original motion needs to accept that amendment. And once that is accepted, it can be recorded. And then the presiding officer calls for any additional discussion. And if there is none, then they call for the vote. All in favor, aye. Any opposed? And understand that an abstention in the statutes is an opposition. So someone can't just choose to abstain. They have to have a stated conflict or reason that they're abstaining. And so a lot of times board members may say that they abstain if they don't agree with the decision. That's a no vote. And so it's recorded in the minutes as being, an opposition, and that's okay. You don't have to have a unanimous consent on everything. You have boards for a reason with different perspectives and different viewpoints. Now, if you're having highly contentious issues, then we might have a broader problem, but don't feel like the goal for you as the president or even the goal for you as a board is to always have unanimous consent. You guys can have dissent. You can have members that may disagree with the decision, but if the majority of the board agrees with the path forward, then the motion can be made and the vote can be taken and you can move along. Now, if there is, owners sort of say, hey, can I comment on this? You got a motion on the table, you got a second on the table, the board's debating something, and the owner says, they start to interject. As the chairperson, understand you have a right to recognize that person or not. So you can say, we have a really long agenda tonight. We're really going to move along. You're welcome to send us your feedback after the meeting or, include it in owner's forum next time, but we're going to move along. Or if it's something that you want some owner input about, it might be reasonable for you as the chair to say, yeah, go ahead and share your thoughts with us. be careful about this, because this can set a tricky dynamic with the community feeling like they get to interject into those board discussions and debates. But it's really up to the board and the community and what works best for you. There's no hard and fast rule that says absolutely don't let the owner speak at a board meeting. It just really depends upon how your community dynamics work. And sometimes you have chairs and presidents that aren't quite as comfortable with this process of running the meetings. And so our staff can help with this too. It's not, we don't want you to all become parliamentarians. It's just understanding the basics of the format of the meeting so that you have the tools to run the meeting effectively. So I hinted at this, that there's always this goal of 1 hour board meetings. And so how do we get to 1 hour board meeting? Well, you set agendas for things that you're going to be making decisions on. The board is reading the information that we have sent to them prior to the meeting and coming in either with their questions or prepared to make decisions on things. You're, starting on time. Sometimes board meetings can be a little bit of a social hour. And that, that's a great thing. It builds community spirit. It builds camaraderie. We're certainly not saying to squash that. But keep in mind, people are busy and serving on boards can be a little bit daunting. We want to make that process as easy as possible so more volunteers want to participate in the process. Using those Robert's Rules of Order tools are a fantastic way for you to speed your meetings along. And, sort of annually or regularly checking in with your board on, why are we holding meetings? What is the purpose? What's our responsibility as board members? Do you have board members that are not reading the packet of information before they come? They're trying to read through things in the board meeting. That can certainly delay the conversation because they're trying to absorb information. Depending upon the length of agendas, sometimes our board packets go out and they're 40, 50 pages long. There's a lot of information sometimes to review depending upon the decisions that are in front of the board at the time. So make sure you come prepared, having read that information and ready to make decisions, that you're sticking to the agenda. It can be really tempting to say like, oh guys, I was at the mailbox the other day and, Joanne brought up this great question on yada, 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 yada. And then you get into this whole conversation. Well, that might not have been something that the board or management vetted. You don't have any information to discuss it, debate it, have, any basis for making decisions. So stick to the agenda. If you as a board member have things you want to add to the agenda, do it at the beginning of the agenda. Say, to the presiding officer, hey, I have this issue that I'd like added to the new business or under, unfinished business. And the board can kind of decide if that's something that they feel would be productive for that meeting, and you can amend the agenda. And then really, sort of getting through the board meeting, summarizing it at the end and sort of moving it along. I promise you, if you get into the rhythm of this, your meetings will run pretty quickly and pretty smoothly. And I think we've seen with COVID and definitely with moving things virtually, our board meetings are getting shorter and shorter. So, dealing with difficult homeowners is becoming definitely a more expanded part of our job as management, the engagement of board members. And it is this fine balance because you are running a corporation, but you are also dealing with people's homes, and it's personal and there's emotions involved and, all of the external pressures right now for everybody. There's certainly a lot of, I would just say more now than ever, we're definitely receiving a lot more sort of grumblings or disgruntled or frustration levels are a little higher. And so as a board member, how do you navigate that process? How do you deal with, somebody who might be being kind of difficult, but who's also your neighbor? And some of you have to live next to them and interact with them. And it is a complex layer to what we do. And the perspective that we help lead our boards and encourage our boards from, is to really try and create this perspective of harmony. Now, that can be hard in some communities, depending upon the culture that you've had and what's been created. But the best recommendation that we can make is to have or allow some honest dialogue. Have it happen in the right forum, have it happen in the right setting. Sometimes that's not a board meeting. If you have an owner that's coming to the board and they're being super disruptive, the board president might want to say to them, hey, I would really love to hear your feedback and to discuss these issues with you. We have some business to conduct tonight. Can you and I make an appointment to sit down and have these conversations in the next couple of weeks where you can share your feedback with me, and then we can discuss it as a board in a more effective manner. And so really encourage that honest dialogue, but we very much encourage it to happen in the right circumstances and in the right format. And so as a board member, feel free to say, hey, we're volunteers. We're here to make decisions and do a job. We're giving our time to the community. We really appreciate your feedback. And I would love to hear it, just not at this very moment. And having some of that sort of pre-language worked out in your head can help if you're in a board meeting and it's getting contentious, or those frustrations are raising. Then they're definitely having those things pre-worked out in your head or written down can help you run those meetings. And again, this is something that our managers can certainly help aid and step in and say, hey, thank you so much for your feedback, but we're going to move on and we'll follow up with you at a later date. Aligning expectations is definitely a piece that helps communities. Frequently where we see that frustration boil is because the owners, they don't necessarily understand why the board made a decision or what drove that decision or the background from it. The board has this benefit of all of this background. And if the owners aren't coming to the board meetings and they're not hearing that, then they see something flat on a piece of paper or a notice or something along those lines, and they don't necessarily have the context to that. So aligning those expectations, making sure that communication to your ownership gives a little bit of that background, but also we recommend and support our boards in really having clear boundaries. Just because you serve on the board doesn't mean that the owners get to sort of abuse you or beat up on you, be uncivil in any way. That is something that is, in our contracts between our board members and, us as a management company, a little harder to enforce with your ownership. But I think empowering your board to have those clear boundaries to say, we appreciate that you might be emotional or frustrated about this situation. We would love to hear more about this with you, but we're going to ask that everybody be respectful. No name calling, no, accusations, things of that nature are super unproductive in those formats. And so feel comfortable as a board member setting those boundaries. Our managers and we as a company will always back you up. And if you have a group of unruly homeowners too, you might consider, what environment is best for us to be successful, and how do we set some policies around that to make sure that we can still run this business of running the homeowners association. And this has gotten a little bit easier, I would say, in the last year where we have more virtual meetings, because there's definitely like mute buttons. And if somebody's getting, unruly or won't stop interrupting the board, our managers can permanently mute them. If they're getting really unruly, we can kick them off calls. And, I think it's always interesting to have conversations with boards and share with them, what are some of the things that people get most upset about. Some of the things that people are just really, sort of triggered by are some things that as a corporation, we can't entirely help. It's the process of running your business. I would say, sending collection reminder notices is definitely something that kind of sets people off. We've tried to make those notices as nice and friendly as possible. But the reality is that you have an obligation to your owners to collect assessments. We have an obligation to make sure as your management company that we're sending those notices. So if those owners continue to be delinquent, that you can take action against them. And so it's this double-edged sword that sometimes the things that they're upset about, you as a board, you might not be able to change. You might not be able to tell that owner, well, yeah, we won't send you late notices if you don't pay your assessments on time, because then if they continue to not pay their assessments, you might not be able to take action against them. So there's some things, when you're aligning those expectations, that it's important as a board to understand where are those areas of latitude, where are the things that we can be flexible on, but where are the things that, we really have to abide by the governing documents. And you can have conversations with your manager about where some of those boundaries might be, because it's going to be somewhat circumstance specific. And so it's hard to kind of give you generalized advice in this format, but feel free to have those conversations. And if you have a particularly unruly group of owners, or you have that disruption going on in your community, we do have civility pledges that boards, have utilized to sort of set engagement parameters. This is how community members need to engage with owners. This is how community members need to engage with the board. This is how community members need to engage with staff. We're all agreeing that we're going to treat each other with respect and behave. 10 years ago, if you told me that we would be adopting civility pledges in our communities, I wouldn't have believed it, but it has definitely become more prevalent. And really, honestly, sometimes you're just going to have that owner that wants to come to every board meeting and complain about the same thing. And sometimes it's not even something that the association has any authority over. And so, sometimes the board just is going to have to learn how to navigate that. And thanks so much for bringing it up, but we're going to move along. And if you have additional questions or concerns, please reach out to the management company or, to us at a later date. So sometimes understanding that there are going to be things that just continually come up because the owner might be bored, or, they might not want to talk to the city about it, or want to spend the energy to solve it in the avenue that you've provided to them. They really feel like it should be your issue and it's not really the association's authority. And, we had our first instance of having sort of some aggressive or violent behavior against a staff member probably 4 years ago. And I would love to say that it's over something that seemed, reasonable for people to get that passionate about, but generally it's over things like parking, or the fact that they have a tenant living next to them, or they don't, like the fact that, there's a pesky cat that lives next to them. You'd be surprised at some of the things that come up that owners get, really frustrated about. But this is one of the reasons why our office chose to have an access control system, because we did have a few instances of homeowners making threats against our staff. And so now we control who comes into our buildings. Obviously, in the last year, our building has been somewhat shut down to the public, but we don't condone this, not towards our staff, not towards homeowners, not towards board members. So we will certainly always help support and bring resources to the board if you have these types of situations going on. We do have a handful of these going on right now where we've got owners, being pretty, aggressive towards board members. And so I think it's just a sign of the stress that everyone is under, and hopefully that improves. But we do have additional resources if it does get to an extreme situation for you as a board. Make sure that you're letting our managers know of anything. If you're running into people in the community and they're, saying things or being inappropriate or any of those things, you should always raise that to our manager so we can try and assist with that. And if it's happening at a board meeting, we're going to step in and try and do our best to kind of help navigate that for you. Sometimes if things are out of hand, it may be as simple as saying, I really just think we should adjourn this meeting and we can reconvene when everybody's had a chance to kind of cool off. So that kind of covers our topics today. If you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat, or if you would like to unmute yourself and turn your camera on and you have questions, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have around our meetings. All right, well, it doesn't look like we have any questions popping up. Oh.
Hi, sorry, this is Melanie. Can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Sorry, it's just easier for me. So if the executive board meetings are for decision voting, like, you know, are we going to spend money on alley maintenance or whatever? When do you do the discussion, the back and forth, the pros and cons? Because from what I gathered, the board meeting is not the time for that.
No, you certainly want to have that discussion. What you want to try and avoid is like endless discussion. What helps to pinpoint that, and there's two ways to go about this. So if you have an agenda item, so you're discussing alley maintenance, you're likely going to have an issue summary from us that's going to detail, you know, what the scope of the work is, some bids, some proposal, you know, bid comparisons. So there's generally going to be information for you to be making a decision on. So there's two ways to go about it. Sometimes the board will debate that issue prior to making the motion. There's no right or wrong there. The typical way for Robert's Rules of Order is that the motion is made first and seconded, and then the debate happens. Sometimes if you aren't at a consensus or you aren't at like a pinpoint of what that decision is going to be, boards will debate it, make the motion, maybe debate it a little bit more, ask some clarifying questions, and then vote on the motion. Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you. I have another question if nobody else has one.
Go ahead.
It's sort of silly. So maybe this is for a different meeting, but how do you best address issues that are something maybe you would consider little? An example would be leaf blowers has been an issue in our area lately. People are annoyed at the leaf blowers. So, I mean, this sort of goes along with maybe something you said earlier, that where you just say, thanks for raising the concern, and sort of just let people vent.
Yeah.
So the secret.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are some of the things that ultimately, like, your board has to decide, is this really our responsibility to take on? Can we solve the problem? You know, if you're a community where you're doing front yard maintenance and you have to have the leaf blowers there, maybe you can adjust the time that the crews are coming, but there ultimately might not be a solution to that. There may not be yes, let us fix this. And it's always okay for boards to say, we really appreciate your feedback. We've taken it into consideration. This is the way that this situation needs to operate. And if we can modify it in the future, we certainly will. Thank you so much. It might be that type of scenario. And if you have those kind of repeat issues, sometimes having that canned language for the chair to sort of say, oh, wait, this has come up and here's what the board's just discussed in the past. Thank you, but we're going to move on.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's tricky. And like I said, you know, it's not, it's personal. You know, we're dealing with people's homes, dealing with communities, and there's this fine balance with creating that community and that culture, but also allowing the board to run the business too. It's kind of a fine balance. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for coming. You will get an email from David with a copy of the PowerPoint slides from today, along with the handout for the Robert's Rules of Order, just simple guide to making motions and calling for the vote and things of that nature. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me or email your manager. We're happy to follow up on anything you might have questions on. Have a great day.